Hello everyone. This is, I guess, part 2 of Project 8 Unwrap and Texture. This first video, I really cover more of the UV tools and an extra set of UV bonus tools for doing character unwrapping. Also, I cover how to set up a project properly so that the textures work and stay linked, and you don't get a broken hierarchy. So if you have any of those questions, watch this video. In this video, we're basically going to be talking about this medieval house from an organizational standpoint of how I would approach a project like this. So let's bounce over to Maya. Here's the house asset loaded up, and the first thing that you'll notice, and actually the first thing you should always do when you get a new scene or an asset is just kind of inspect it and make sure, maybe there's a weird spot that you don't like, or texture seam is broken where like a vert comes through another face or something like that. For the most part, I tried to clean this up, but I might have missed some stuff. And feel free to add to this if you want to, or change some things around and make it your own. But the first thing you should always do is crack open your outliner and just look what's in here. So there's a lot of pieces. This is 200 pieces, and it may not even wind up needing to be a bunch of separate pieces in game. In fact, that actually doesn't really make a lot of sense if the only thing on here that needs to animate is the door. Or maybe none of this animates, and maybe it's just off in the distance as a prop that you see or walk by and you never really interact with. Or maybe you just pick up something off the table as you go by. So what we need to do is be careful how we approach this hierarchy. It wouldn't make any sense to come in here and start naming every one of these pieces if, when I'm all done, I'm going to group all of it back into one big object and then name it cottage or medieval house. I've just wasted a lot of time naming and unnaming 200 things. So then how do we approach this? Well, first off, let's look at Unity real quick. I downloaded this asset from the asset store and then cleaned it up and tore it apart for you guys so you'd have it to play with. And those sprites that are kind of around that little deck area, this is what they did with it. They used basically Ivy, and then they mapped a alpha to the transparency so that it only shows up in certain places. And then they did the same with this thatch on the roof where there's transparency at the edges. And in Maya, as you'll see in just a second, we've also got these little polygons that kind of stick out a little bit. And basically that's more thatch. Right here, this is something I fixed. This is stuff that was going on with the planes feeding through each other. But basically this will give you an idea. Now these are photo sourced. These are drag and drop on here, and I kind of hate the way it looks. It just looks like someone took a picture of a patio and then pasted it on this. Ideally, maybe this piece here would go into ZBrush and you would sculpt the rock into it and then hand paint it. But don't stress out doing all that. Just focus on getting the textures made for this thing. So let's go back to, let's close this scene file here. Let's go back to Maya. In fact, I'm just going to quit Unity. And let's talk about how to approach all these bits and pieces. So first thing I'm going to do is start kind of grouping things. A lot of these maybe are going to be the same material. So like these two wall pieces probably going to be the same material. Maybe this wall here and this wall here. Probably this wall and this wall. Probably this wall. And if I open my outliner back up, you can see I've got all these random shapes kind of selected. And so I'm going to Command or Control G, make myself a group, and then I'm going to assign it a new material. So let's just do it Lambert. And I'm going to name that wall material. And then I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste that into the shading group so that we know that they belong together. And then I'm just going to make the color something obvious, something different. Maybe we'll do like a browny orange color. Okay, so now I can see literally in like a second everything that that has that material, and I can grab that group. So let's name the group too and call it wall group. And that way, instead of naming all the pieces, I just named one group for now, and maybe later on we'll get rid of that. So next, let's say all these beam pieces are going to be the same kind of wood texture. So take a second, and I'm going to select them all, and try not to miss any. So maybe this little post right here, maybe this post, and maybe the peaks up here. Yeah, let's do these guys too. Maybe we'll leave these window trim pieces for something else. And that guy. So, alright, I think that's good. If I missed some, it's okay, we can always add them later. So I'm just going to group those, and we'll call this like beam group or something that makes sense. And again, we're going to give it another material. So let's just give it a Lambert. And I'm not so much caring whether these actually need Lamberts or not. Like, likely this will just be one material, the two materials when it's done. So I'm just using these as identifiers. And I'm just going to paste in here that this is the beam material. Copy that and paste it to the shading group. And again, we'll change its color. So let's make it something dark so it's obvious. And so real quickly, I'm starting to get an idea for what was in that group and what wasn't. You can see that I missed one right there. It's way up here. So what I can do is just middle mouse and drag it down, hold it down here at the bottom, and the outliner will scroll. And when I get to wherever my group is, there it is, I can just drag and drop it in, and then I can add that material to it too. So give it beam material. So it's pretty easy to make quick changes if you need to. Now I'm not going to do this whole thing because it's redundant, but what I will do is we'll talk now about how to approach laying these bits and pieces out in the outliner. So I'm assuming you've already gone and taken time to select these shells, and you're going to have to, one at a time, take these guys and sew them back together so that they make sense. I'm pretty sure on this guy that the verts might be separate. Yeah, so this asset here, they actually need merged back together, which is pretty easy. You could just select that and do a merge on it. So it's up to you guys to clean this up, clean up all these little beam pieces. And then what you need to think about is the grain direction. So all these vertical pieces, likely the grain's going to be running this way. And on these, likely it's going to be running that way. And on this, it's likely going to be running that way and this way and so forth. And so what makes sense in the UV editor, so real quick, I'm just going to select all the UVs and go to the layout tools and just make sure that I'm set to full square and do a layout. So what makes sense in here is that the grain direction of every one of our bits and pieces, we try to make the same. And we'd want to do this after we sew all the pieces together so that we know how they're going to wind up. And then we want to take, when we're done doing that, we want to take anything that winds up at 45, like maybe this guy here, and we'd want to carefully rotate those guys back till they're facing straight with the texture. And the reason why we want to do that is because then I can apply my wood grain all in one direction, and I don't have to come in and try to hand paint the shells like a million different directions. I can literally just come in and paint. Unless you're doing this in 3D, in which case you can optimize your map a little bit different and then just paint in the free space what you want to see. But even then, it'd be nice if this was lined up in case we want to do any like procedural texturing to it or anything. So pretend you've got this beam section the way you want it, and in our UV outliner we've optimized UV editor, we've optimized and packed this shell the best we can. What I can do now is I can take that group, I can select everything in the group, all these pieces, and I can go up to mesh and I can combine them. And remember, this makes history, so I'm going to Alt-Shift-Delete all that history. And now what we've got is just this one object with one UV layout. And so then I can do the same for the walls. I can grab the wall group, I can go to the UV editor, I'm going to select everything and lay them out, and then I would take time to stitch all the edges and orient all these things the direction I want it to face. And once I get that perfect, I'm going to come over to the outliner and take everything that was in that group, and then I'm going to mesh combine that group. And again, makes history, so Alt-Shift-Delete the history. So now I've got two objects, the walls and the beams, and right now in the editor, they're both kind of stacked on top of each other. So one thing we can do, we could say have one texture used for that, one texture used for that, one texture used for all of the thatch, and so forth, one texture used for the rock or brick or whatever this happens to be, and that'd be fine. Or what we can do is just have one big texture atlas. And the way that we would approach that would be to say take one of these objects, and in our editor I'm going to select all of its UVs, and this time I'm going to say lay it out to just like the top left corner. I want to make sure it rotates off because I want these to stay oriented the way that we've placed them. And I'm going to lay them out. And so now I packed it just to right there. And then I'm going to select the wall group right here, and I'm going to go to the editor again. I'm going to select all these guys, and this time I'm going to go to the layout options, and I'm going to say top right instead, and I'm going to lay that out. And I could continue doing this with the thatch and the other things in different positions. And then what I can do is I can take these two objects and I can mesh combine those guys and delete their history. And so now if I look at the UV editor, I have one section that represents where we'd want beam wood texture, and I've got another section that represents where we'd have whatever texture we're going to use on the walls. And then I could have a section here for whatever I'm painting on to, say, the thatch, and so forth. And then in the alpha channel, if we're in Photoshop, we create an alpha channel, and that black and white map in a 16-bit color format, that would then decide where the transparency lands on these materials and so forth. Interestingly, you'll wind up with like one texture atlas, one image with all these textures. You can still assign, say, a different material to the wood than you do to the side of the house, because the only place this is ever going to get texture information is from right here. So the material itself can be different, and you can still use the same image file on multiple different sections because of where their UV space lands. So if you were to continue to do that, eventually maybe you've got one with 4 textures, or you've got 16 textures on here, or however many you need, and you can continue grouping this object until you wind up with one big object that just has one map, or you could have a couple separate objects if you want a couple maps. Just up to you guys. Just make sure when you're all done that it's in one big group. If it's one piece, it doesn't have to be grouped, but if it is a couple pieces, put it in a group and make sure all the bits and pieces are named. And I think that's all I got for you. So, have fun. Hopefully this will help you out, and the last video will help you out. Talk to you guys soon.